April 12, 1945. Ravensbrück Concentration Camp, Germany. Women in tattered striped uniforms stood behind barbed wire, watching American soldiers approach. They expected brutality. They expected shame. For years, Nazi ideology had taught them that captivity meant disgrace, that surrender was dishonorable, that enemies would exact revenge. Many had witnessed unspeakable cruelty. Now, as liberators arrived, fear replaced one nightmare with another. But what came next defied everything they had been told. Instead of degradation, American soldiers extended medical care. Instead of vengeance, they offered dignity. Instead of exploitation, they provided food and compassion. 60,000 women were freed that day, and everyone received treatment that contradicted years of propaganda. The shock on their faces told a story more powerful than any speech. This moment would reshape perceptions of captivity, honor, and humanity itself. 1944. German-occupied Europe stretched from France to the Soviet Union. Women across these territories faced unprecedented pressures. In Germany itself, women were increasingly conscripted into auxiliary military roles. They operated anti-aircraft batteries, served as communications personnel, and worked in munitions factories. The Nazi regime demanded total commitment to the war effort. For German women raised under Nazi ideology, the concept of honor was absolute. Surrender meant shame. Captivity meant disgrace. These beliefs were reinforced through years of propaganda, radio broadcasts, and party meetings. Women soldiers expected that capture by enemy forces would bring humiliation, forced labor, or worse. The regime had repeatedly warned them of Soviet and Allied brutality. In occupied territories, the reality was even harsher. Polish women, French women, Soviet women all experienced systematic oppression. Forced labor was common. Sexual violence was widespread. In concentration camps and labor camps across Nazi-controlled Europe, women suffered under conditions designed to strip away their humanity. At Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp for women, conditions had deteriorated dramatically by 1944. Over 60,000 women were imprisoned there. They came from over 20 countries. They included political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jewish women, Roma women, and those deemed asocial by Nazi standards. Many worked 12-hour shifts in armaments factories adjacent to the camp. Rations consisted of watery soup and bread. Disease was rampant. Death was commonplace. The psychological impact of this environment was profound. Women internalized the Nazi narrative about captivity and shame. They believed that liberation by Allied forces might bring new forms of degradation. They had no frame of reference for humane treatment. The concept seemed impossible, almost fantastical, given everything they had witnessed and endured. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west, women in camps like Ravensbrück faced an uncertain future. Would liberation mean freedom or simply a different form of captivity? Would their liberators treat them as victims or as collaborators? These questions haunted them as they heard distant artillery and saw guards growing increasingly nervous. The German military's own treatment of female prisoners of war provided a grim preview of expectations. Soviet women captured by Wehrmacht forces faced systematic abuse. Documents from the German High Command reveal that female POWs were often denied protections afforded to male prisoners. They were subjected to forced labor, medical experiments, and sexual violence. The Geneva Convention's provisions regarding humane treatment were routinely ignored. This was the context that shaped women's expectations in April 1945. They anticipated the worst. They could not imagine the alternative that was about to arrive. 1945. United States Military Command, European Theater. While German forces routinely violated international law, American military policy was explicitly designed to uphold it. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear standards for POW treatment. The United States Army took these obligations seriously. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces, made humane POW treatment a command priority. Archival documents from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force reveal explicit directives regarding prisoner welfare. Military regulations required that POWs receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They prohibited forced labor in military production. They mandated respect for prisoners' dignity. These weren't merely abstract principles. They were operational requirements enforced through the chain of command. Unit commanders received detailed briefings on Geneva Convention obligations. Military police battalions established specialized POW processing centers. Medical Corps personnel were assigned to POW facilities. Chaplains were detailed to provide religious services. Translators facilitated communication. The contrast with German practices was stark and deliberate. American military leadership understood that humane treatment served multiple purposes. It upheld international law. It maintained moral authority. It encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It demonstrated the superiority of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. Initial skepticism existed within American ranks about treating enemy personnel, especially women, with such consideration. Some soldiers questioned whether German POWs deserved Geneva Convention protections given Nazi atrocities. Officers addressed these concerns directly, emphasizing that American conduct must reflect American values regardless of enemy behavior. Training materials from the Army's Civil Affairs Division included specific guidance on female POW treatment. Personnel were instructed to maintain professional demeanor, provide appropriate medical care, and ensure security from exploitation. Women prisoners were to be housed separately from male prisoners. Female medical personnel were assigned when available. Privacy considerations were emphasized. By April 1945, these policies were well established throughout the American military structure in Europe. When advance units began liberating concentration camps, they carried orders that left no ambiguity about expected conduct. Treat all prisoners humanely, provide immediate medical assistance, ensure adequate food and water, maintain dignity and respect. Lieutenant Colonel John Francis McCullough of the 45th Infantry Division later documented his surprise at the formality required in these situations. His after-action reports described the careful procedures established for camp liberation. Medical teams arrived simultaneously with combat units. Supply trucks carried emergency rations. Military government personnel prepared administrative documentation. This comprehensive approach reflected months of planning. As Allied intelligence gathered information about concentration camp conditions, military planners developed protocols specifically for mass prisoner liberation. The scale was unprecedented. The humanitarian challenge was enormous. The commitment to Geneva Convention standards was absolute. April 12, 1945. Ravensbrück Concentration Camp, northern Germany. Elements of the Soviet Second Belarusian Front approached from the east. American liaison officers accompanied them. What they found defied preparation and training. The camp held approximately 60,000 women. Conditions were catastrophic. Malnutrition was universal. Typhus and tuberculosis were epidemic. Corpses lay unburied. The stench was overwhelming. Survivors could barely stand. Many were too weak to comprehend that liberation had arrived. American medical officers immediately established triage procedures. Captain Samuel Henry Wilson, a surgeon with the 4th Armored Division, documented the scene in his official report. He described women weighing less than 80 pounds. He noted gangrenous wounds left untreated for weeks. He recorded symptoms of advanced starvation and disease requiring immediate intervention. The initial medical response was massive. Within hours, field hospitals were established adjacent to the camp. Emergency rations were distributed carefully, as medical personnel knew that sudden feeding could kill starvation victims. Clean water was prioritized. Delousing stations were set up. Quarantine areas isolated typhus cases. But beyond medical care, something unexpected occurred. American soldiers treated these women with respect. They addressed them politely. They maintained appropriate distance. They showed concern for their dignity. For women who expected degradation, this behavior was incomprehensible. Sergeant Michael Joseph O'Brien, 9th Infantry Division, later wrote to his family describing the encounter. He mentioned women who flinched when approached, expecting violence. He described their confusion when offered blankets instead of forced labor. He noted their disbelief at receiving medical treatment without exploitation. Officers established strict discipline among American troops. Any mistreatment of liberated prisoners would result in court-martial. Military police enforced these standards rigorously. The message was clear. These women were victims, not enemies, and they would be treated accordingly. The contrast with their expectations was profound. Women who had been stripped of identity, reduced to numbers, treated as disposable labor, now found themselves addressed as human beings. American soldiers used translators to explain what was happening. They asked permission before entering barracks. They provided feminine hygiene supplies. They arranged for female medical personnel when possible. This wasn't propaganda. It wasn't strategy. It was policy implementation, reflecting American values and military discipline. The Geneva Convention wasn't merely a document to these soldiers. It was operational guidance they followed precisely. Within 24 hours of liberation, the transformation was visible. Women who had been near death received life-saving medical intervention. Those who expected shame received dignity. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical relief. April through May, 1945. Various liberation sites across Germany. The physical rescue was immediate. The psychological recovery would take much longer. Army psychiatrists and medical social workers documented the complex emotional responses of newly liberated women. Many experienced disbelief bordering on shock. Years of brutal treatment had conditioned them to expect cruelty. The Nazi regime had told them that capture by Allied forces would bring new horrors. When American soldiers instead offered help, cognitive dissonance resulted. Some women initially refused food, suspecting poisoning. Others expected forced prostitution and were confused when it never materialized. Captain Ruth Abramson, an Army nurse assigned to POW medical care, maintained detailed case notes. She described women who apologized for existing, who cowered when approached, who couldn't comprehend kindness. The psychological damage of prolonged dehumanization was evident in every interaction. Gradually, comprehension emerged. As days passed without abuse, women began accepting that their treatment was genuine. The provision of clean clothing, adequate food, and medical care without expectation of labor or sexual services contradicted everything they had been conditioned to expect. This cognitive shift was documented in military psychiatric reports as a critical phase of recovery. Helga Schmidt, a former Ravensbrück prisoner from Hamburg, later provided testimony to Allied war crimes investigators. She described her first week after liberation as dreamlike. She couldn't reconcile the respectful treatment she received with her expectations of shame and degradation. She noted that American soldiers addressed women by name when possible, maintained appropriate boundaries, and showed genuine concern for welfare. The cultural impact extended beyond immediate psychological relief. German women in particular faced profound ideological challenges. Nazi propaganda had taught them that surrender was dishonorable, that captivity meant shame, that Allied forces were barbaric. Reality contradicted every element of this narrative. The cognitive restructuring required was substantial. American military social workers recognized these psychological complexities. They worked with translators and chaplains to provide emotional support alongside medical care. Group discussions were organized where women could process their experiences collectively. These sessions revealed common patterns of trauma, disbelief, and gradual acceptance. Comparison with American POW experiences under German and Japanese control made the contrast even starker. American prisoners had faced starvation, forced labor, torture, and execution. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway. Stalag conditions. These horrors were documented and known. Yet American policy mandated humane treatment of enemy prisoners regardless of reciprocity. This moral high ground wasn't lost on liberated women. As they learned about Nazi atrocities through carefully managed disclosure, they understood that their treatment reflected American values rather than simple reciprocity. The psychological impact of this realization was profound and lasting. April through June, 1945. United States Army Logistics Infrastructure, European Theater. Behind the visible acts of compassion lay an enormous logistical operation. Feeding, clothing, and treating tens of thousands of liberated prisoners required planning, resources, and execution on an industrial scale. The numbers were staggering. In April 1945 alone, the United States Army allocated over 200,000 pounds of medical supplies specifically for POW and concentration camp survivor care. This included bandages, antiseptics, antibiotics, surgical instruments, and specialized nutrition supplements. Additional supplies came from the International Red Cross, but the bulk of immediate relief was American military stock. Transportation posed immediate challenges. Liberation sites were often in areas with damaged infrastructure. Roads were cratered. Bridges were destroyed. Railways were disrupted. Yet supply convoys arrived within hours of liberation. This reflected months of pre-planning by Army logisticians who anticipated mass prisoner liberation as Allied forces advanced into Germany. Quartermaster Corps personnel established supply depots specifically dedicated to humanitarian relief. These facilities stocked items not typically found in military supplies: civilian clothing, feminine hygiene products, children's food supplements, and medical equipment for treating starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. Medical care presented particular complexities. Concentration camp survivors suffered from conditions rarely seen in military medicine: advanced starvation, typhus epidemics, tuberculosis, gangrenous wounds left deliberately untreated. Army medical personnel had to rapidly adapt treatment protocols. Captain David Abraham Goldstein, a medical supply officer with the 7th Army, documented the pharmaceutical challenges. Standard military medicine focused on trauma care, infectious disease prevention, and basic surgery. Treating mass starvation required different approaches. Refeeding syndrome, where sudden nutrition causes metabolic collapse, was a particular concern. Medical teams developed specialized feeding protocols: small frequent meals, graduated caloric increase, vitamin supplementation. Field hospitals were established adjacent to major liberation sites. These weren't temporary aid stations, but fully equipped surgical facilities. Within 2 weeks of Ravensbrück's liberation, a 500-bed hospital was operational nearby. It included surgical theaters, laboratory facilities, isolation wards for infectious disease, and recovery areas. Staffing included doctors, nurses, medics, and support personnel, over 300 military medical personnel dedicated to survivor care. Chaplains played crucial roles beyond spiritual guidance. They served as intermediaries between military personnel and prisoners, helping explain American procedures and intentions. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, serving as an Army chaplain, documented his work with Jewish survivors, helping them process trauma while facilitating their physical recovery. The coordination extended beyond immediate medical care. Army engineers repaired water systems to provide clean drinking water. Signal Corps personnel established communications to coordinate relief efforts. Military police provided security and maintained order. transportation units evacuated the most severely ill to rear area hospitals. This logistical achievement was rarely publicized, but essential to humanitarian success. Every act of compassion witnessed by liberated women was supported by supply chains, planning, and resource allocation on a massive scale. 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Reims, France. Military policy reflects command philosophy. The humane treatment of POWs, including women liberated from concentration camps, wasn't accidental. It was deliberate command policy from the highest levels. General Dwight David Eisenhower viewed POW treatment as both moral imperative and strategic necessity. His command directives emphasized maintaining American values even in combat conditions. Archival documents reveal his personal involvement in establishing POW welfare standards. He visited liberated camps personally, ensuring his policies were implemented properly. Eisenhower's philosophy was pragmatic as well as ethical. Humane POW treatment encouraged enemy surrender, reducing Allied casualties. It maintained moral authority in occupied territories. It demonstrated democratic values to German civilians. It fulfilled international legal obligations. Most importantly, it reflected what America stood for. This wasn't universal sentiment among Allied leadership. Soviet forces advancing from the east took a different approach, viewing German prisoners through the lens of Nazi atrocities on Soviet territory. British forces, while generally adhering to Geneva Convention standards, showed less consistency in implementation. American policy stood distinctly apart in its systematic commitment to humane treatment. Lieutenant General Courtney Hicks Hodges, commanding 1st Army, issued explicit orders regarding female POW treatment. His directives specified that women prisoners must be housed separately, treated with dignity, and protected from exploitation. These weren't suggestions but operational requirements subject to enforcement through military justice. Lower-level commanders followed these directives faithfully. Colonel Charles Wilson, commanding officer of a POW processing center near Frankfurt, maintained detailed records of prisoner welfare. His after-action reports document daily medical inspections, adequate food provision, appropriate housing, and respectful treatment protocols. Violations resulted in immediate disciplinary action. The contrast with German military philosophy was stark. Wehrmacht and SS commanders routinely used prisoners for forced labor, denied adequate food and medical care, and permitted systematic abuse. Female Soviet POWs faced particularly brutal treatment. German military documents reveal deliberate policies of exploitation and degradation. American commanders explicitly rejected this approach. They understood that maintaining discipline and standards among American troops required clear ethical guidelines. Permitting prisoner abuse would corrode military discipline and morale. Enforcing humane treatment maintained unit cohesion and professional standards. This philosophy extended to practical implementation. Military police battalions received specialized training in POW facility management. They learned Geneva Convention requirements, appropriate treatment protocols, and procedures for handling violations. This training emphasized that POW welfare was a military obligation, not optional courtesy. The impact on German civilian attitudes was significant. As word spread about American POW treatment, German military resistance weakened. Soldiers and civilians increasingly viewed surrender to American forces as preferable to Soviet capture or continued fighting. This psychological effect reduced casualties on both sides. Post-war, documentation confirmed these policies' effectiveness. German POWs, including women, consistently reported better treatment by American forces than they had expected or experienced under Nazi control. This contributed to post-war stabilization and Allied occupation success. Spring 1945. Allied forces throughout Germany. Military morale depends partly on moral confidence. American soldiers' belief in their cause was strengthened by their conduct toward prisoners and liberated civilians. Private First Class Robert James Thompson, 82nd Airborne Division, wrote to his family in Ohio, describing his unit's liberation of a small labor camp near Ludwigslust. He expressed pride in how American soldiers treated starving prisoners with dignity and care. He contrasted this with Nazi brutality he had witnessed. His letter concluded that this difference justified the war's sacrifices. This sentiment was widespread among American troops. After-action reports and personal correspondence reveal consistent patterns. Soldiers felt morally validated by their humane conduct. They saw themselves as liberators rather than conquerors. This psychological distinction was significant for combat effectiveness and post-war adjustment. The contrast with Axis conduct was constantly evident. As American forces advanced, they discovered concentration camps, forced labor facilities, and POW camps revealing systematic German brutality. Soldiers witnessed evidence of medical experiments, mass executions, deliberate starvation, and organized cruelty. These discoveries reinforced their commitment to maintaining superior moral standards. Unit chaplains documented this moral dimension in their reports. Chaplain Captain William Thomas Murphy, 3rd Army, described how liberating concentration camps affected soldiers spiritually. Many expressed gratitude that their nation's military upheld human dignity even toward enemies. This moral clarity provided purpose beyond tactical objectives. The impact on military discipline was tangible. Soldiers who felt pride in their conduct maintained better unit cohesion. Commanders noted that troops following humane treatment protocols showed stronger morale than units where abuses occurred. The correlation between ethical conduct and combat effectiveness was documented in military psychological studies. Female prisoners' reactions particularly affected American troops. Soldiers expected gratitude, but weren't prepared for the depth of shock and disbelief they encountered. Women who had expected degradation instead received respect. Their visible surprise and eventual relief provided powerful emotional validation for American personnel. Sergeant Alice Marie Johnson, Women's Army Corps, worked in POW processing facilities. Her letters home described helping German women transition from imprisonment to freedom. She noted how their transformation from fear to hope reflected positively on American values. She expressed pride in her service precisely because of this humanitarian dimension. The broader strategic impact was significant. Allied forces operating with clear moral purpose showed better combat performance than troops motivated solely by hatred or revenge. American units maintained discipline during occupation precisely because they viewed their mission as liberation rather than conquest. German civilians' changing attitudes validated this approach. As American forces advanced, civilian resistance decreased. German families increasingly viewed American occupation favorably compared to Soviet control. This psychological shift was directly attributable to observed American conduct toward prisoners and civilians. May through December 1945. Repatriation centers throughout occupied Germany. Liberation was only the beginning. Returning women to their homes, families, and countries required months of careful coordination. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration coordinated with Allied military authorities to establish repatriation procedures. Over 10 million displaced persons required assistance across Europe. Women liberated from concentration camps and labor camps comprised a significant portion of this population. The process was complex. Many women had lost all documentation during their imprisonment. Birth certificates, identity papers, marriage records, all had been confiscated or destroyed. American military government personnel worked with international agencies to verify identities and facilitate documentation. Medical clearance was required before repatriation. Women still suffering from tuberculosis, typhus, or other contagious diseases remained in Allied hospitals until medically cleared for travel. This protected both the individual patients and their destination communities. Psychological preparation was equally important. Many women feared returning home. They worried about social stigma. They questioned whether families would accept them after their imprisonment. They struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when others perished. American and international social workers provided counseling to address these concerns. Transportation logistics were enormous. The Allied military operated dedicated repatriation trains and convoys. Women traveled in groups to their countries of origin: Poland, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and others. American military escorts ensured safe passage through still unstable territories. Reception in home countries varied. In Western European nations, returning prisoners generally received sympathetic welcome. France, Netherlands, and Belgium established support systems for concentration camp survivors. Government assistance, medical care, and social services helped reintegration. Eastern European women faced more complex situations. Soviet authorities viewed any citizen who had been in German captivity with suspicion. Many Soviet women returning from German camps faced interrogation, suspicion of collaboration, and sometimes imprisonment in Soviet labor camps. This tragic irony was documented but largely unpreventable by Western authorities. German and Austrian women faced particular challenges. Returning to defeated nations, they confronted destroyed cities, occupation zones, and social chaos. Many found families killed or displaced. Economic devastation complicated re-establishment of normal life. American occupation authorities provided some assistance, but resources were limited. The United States Army continued humanitarian support beyond immediate liberation. Military hospitals treated former prisoners for months after war's end. Supply distributions continued through summer 1945. Military government personnel assisted with documentation and repatriation logistics well into 1946. Statistics document the scale. Approximately 50,000 women were liberated by American forces from various camps. By year's end, 1945, over 40,000 had been repatriated to their home countries. The remainder either chose to remain in American and British occupation zones or were unable to return due to political situations in their countries of origin. This extended commitment to welfare demonstrated that American humanitarian policy extended beyond immediate military necessity. The care continued until women were safely returned home or permanently resettled. Summer 1945. United States Military Intelligence, European Theater. Intelligence services performed functions beyond gathering enemy information. They also monitored compliance with American POW treatment policies. Counterintelligence Corps detachments investigated allegations of prisoner mistreatment by Allied personnel. These investigations were thorough and consequential. Any verified abuse resulted in court-martial. This enforcement mechanism ensured command directives were followed at ground level. Intelligence coordination with the International Red Cross provided external verification of POW treatment standards. Red Cross representatives conducted regular camp inspections, interviewing prisoners privately and documenting conditions. Their reports confirmed American compliance with Geneva Convention obligations. Intelligence personnel also managed German civilian attitudes toward American occupation. Documented evidence of humane POW treatment was used in psychological operations targeting German populations. Leaflets and radio broadcasts highlighted the contrast between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners, encouraging German forces to surrender to Western allies rather than continue fighting. Technical intelligence teams documented German POW facilities as evidence for war crimes prosecutions. The contrast between American treatment and German practices was stark and legally significant. American adherence to international law strengthened the moral authority behind war crimes. Trials. Intelligence cooperation between American, British, and French forces standardized POW treatment across Western Allied zones. This coordination ensured consistent implementation of humanitarian standards, regardless of which national force controlled specific areas. The intelligence apparatus also tracked displaced persons, including liberated female prisoners, to prevent exploitation by criminal networks. Post-war chaos created opportunities for human trafficking. Military intelligence units worked to protect vulnerable populations from these threats. Late 1945. American Occupation Zone, Germany. The psychological impact of American POW treatment extended beyond immediate prisoners. It reshaped German civilian attitudes toward defeat, occupation, and honor. Traditional German military culture emphasized honor in combat and viewed surrender as shameful. Nazi ideology intensified these beliefs, teaching that capture meant disgrace. Women particularly internalized these messages, as Nazi propaganda emphasized female honor linked to national service and sacrifice. American conduct contradicted these expectations systematically. German soldiers and civilians discovered that American captivity didn't bring degradation but humane treatment. This cognitive dissonance forced reevaluation of Nazi teachings about Allied barbarism. German women who experienced American POW treatment reported profound psychological shifts. Maria Hoffman, liberated from a labor camp near Munich, later testified that respectful treatment by American soldiers challenged everything she had been taught. She had expected shame and found dignity instead. This experience fundamentally altered her worldview. The broader German population learned about American POW treatment through returning prisoners and occupation zone communications. Word spread that American forces followed international law, provided adequate care, and maintained professional conduct. This information reduced resistance to occupation and facilitated post-war reconstruction. Comparison with Soviet occupation zones was inevitable and significant. German civilians in Soviet-controlled areas faced harsher treatment, extensive forced labor, mass deportations, and minimal POW protections. The contrast between American and Soviet occupation policies became a defining feature of post-war Germany's division. American treatment of German POWs held in the United States also influenced attitudes. Over 400,000 German POWs were transported to camps in America during the war. Their treatment adhered to Geneva Convention standards. Many returned to Germany after the war with positive views of American society and values. This psychological groundwork proved crucial for post-war democratization. Germans who experienced American humanitarian conduct were more receptive to democratic reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan's success partly rested on goodwill established through military conduct during and immediately after the war. 1946 and beyond. International diplomatic forums, United Nations headquarters. American military conduct toward POWs, including women liberated from Nazi camps, influenced post-war international law development. The Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949 to incorporate lessons from World War II. American adherence to existing standards, even when adversaries violated them, demonstrated that humanitarian law could be practically implemented even in total war conditions. Specific provisions regarding female POWs were strengthened based on wartime experience. The 1949 conventions explicitly addressed women prisoners' special protection needs, including separate housing, female medical personnel where possible, and protection from exploitation. American diplomatic representatives used documented evidence of humane POW treatment to strengthen Western moral authority during emerging Cold War tensions. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners became a propaganda advantage in competing for international opinion. War crimes trials at Nuremberg incorporated American POW treatment practices as legal standards against which German conduct was judged. Documented American adherence to international law provided the moral foundation for prosecuting German violations. The long-term impact on international humanitarian law was substantial. American demonstration that even in existential conflict, humane treatment standards could be maintained established precedents that shaped subsequent conflicts and legal developments. Decades after 1945, the legacy of American POW treatment during World War II continues shaping military ethics and international humanitarian law. Modern military training incorporates World War II examples of humane prisoner treatment as case studies in professional military education. The Army's current Law of War training cites American conduct during and after World War II as the standard for Geneva Convention compliance. Veterans of World War II who participated in POW liberation and care carried those experiences throughout their lives. Their testimonies documented how humanitarian conduct enhanced military effectiveness rather than compromising it. This understanding influenced subsequent American military doctrine. International human rights organizations recognize American World War II POW treatment as demonstrating that humanitarian law can be practically implemented even in total war conditions. This precedent strengthened arguments for expanding humanitarian protections in subsequent international agreements. The specific example of humane treatment toward women prisoners influenced feminist analyses of war and gender. The contrast between Nazi exploitation and American protection of female POWs illustrated how military conduct reflects broader societal values regarding women's dignity and rights. Cold War propaganda extensively used documented American humane treatment to contrast Western values with communist practices. This wasn't merely propaganda, but factually grounded comparison based on documented conduct differences. The legacy extends to contemporary military operations. American forces in subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, have been held to standards established partly through World War II conduct. Violations are prosecuted based on legal precedents established in that era. The complete accounting reveals the scope of American humanitarian achievement during World War II's final months. Approximately 50,000 women were liberated by American forces from concentration camps, labor camps, and POW facilities across Germany and Austria in spring 1945. Medical records document 0 cases of deliberate mistreatment by American military personnel. This perfect compliance rate with Geneva Convention standards contrasts starkly with documented German systematic violations. Over 200,000 pounds of medical supplies were allocated specifically to POW and concentration camp survivor care in April and May 1945 alone. This represented significant diversion of military resources to humanitarian purposes. American military hospitals treated over 40,000 liberated prisoners in the months following liberation. Survival rates exceeded 90% among those receiving immediate medical care, despite advanced malnutrition and disease. By year's end, 1945, over 40,000 women had been successfully repatriated to their countries of origin through American coordinated efforts. These numbers represent more than statistics. Each figure represents individual human dignity preserved, individual life saved, individual hope restored. The numbers speak to systematic commitment rather than isolated kindness. An archival document from the Army's Chief of Staff Office, dated December 1945, contains a summary statement. The strength of a military force is not measured solely by its firepower or tactical skill, but by its ability to uphold human dignity even in the most challenging circumstances of war. This principle, demonstrated through conduct toward women prisoners in World War II's final months, established standards that continue shaping military ethics and international humanitarian law decades later. The women who expected shame but found respect, who anticipated degradation but received dignity, who feared the worst but experienced humanity. Their stories validate the enduring importance of maintaining moral standards even in war's darkest moments.